Hi, my name is Sebastian. I'm the product manager here at 8base. If you find this video helpful, please like it as well as subscribe to our channel. It really helps us grow. So in this video, we're going to be building a public chat room using GraphQL subscriptions and Vue.js for our front-end framework. This is going to give you a great primer on how to use subscriptions to build real-time notification applications or real-time event applications. For example, messaging apps, notification feeds, or anything else that you want to use essentially behind the scenes WebSockets for. So let's just dive right in and go ahead and build this. So what I did the other day was went ahead and made a tutorial for how to build this chat room. Frankly, it will take anywhere from like 10 to 15 minutes. It's really fast. What we're going to do is we're going to use Vue.js for the front end with Apollo client as our GraphQL client, and then 8base for the back end. 8base will give us all the resources we need to set up our back end and use the subscriptions via GraphQL. So what we're going to do is we're just going to walk through this tutorial step by step. I'll complete it with you. However, I'll add some context to all the steps as we go through them. Cool? All right, let's get started. So the first thing that we're going to do is go ahead and set up our project. So for example, here it is. We're in the Git repo right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and go to the root of this repo, get the Git URL, and we're going to go ahead and clone it down. Open the terminal, and I'm going to move into my code directory because that's where I like to work out of, and run git clone, add in that, and I'm just going to call it group chat. Awesome. Let that run. Yep. It cloned it down. Cool. So now I'm going to move into the group chat directory. And next it's going to say, oh, just run yarn. So we're going to run yarn, install all the dependencies that we need. Cool. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to actually add a .env.local file to our project. This is going to allow us to specify any environment variables that we need for our group chat component to actually work, namely the endpoints and then the 8base workspace ID that we'll be connecting to. So there's this little command that we can just run in our command line here. So essentially we're just echoing this into a new file called .env.local. Awesome. So now if I open up my files right here, I'm going to make this full screen. I can go ahead and see that, oh, we actually have to open the folder here. So I'm going to go in, open the folder, code, group chat, done. And here we are, .env.local, cool. And so it's asking for our 8base workspace ID. However, we're going to go get that in just a minute. Back here now, what we can do is we can go down and now look. Okay, so now it's going to tell us to import the schema. So we could easily go ahead and build out our data model in 8base. It's a very simple data model, as you're going to see. However, this is a great way to just get introduced to the 8base command line tool, and it will just scaffold the data model that we're going to need for this project. So I'm going to go ahead and just reinstall our, reinstall the command line. So 8base global, add 8base CLI. That will just take a second. And then while that's downloading, we're going to then have to actually authenticate our command line. So that's going to add an .8base RC file to the root of your computer that will store some authentication credentials. So 8base login. And to do this, it's actually going to launch the browser. And then it's going to, if we're logged into 8base, say it is authenticated. And we are good. Cool. I'm just going to close that now. All right. So now with that authenticated, okay, cool. So now what we're going to do is we're actually import our schema. And so we can see that the 8base command line gives us this import statement, and then we can pass it a file path as well as the workspace ID. However, first what we're going to actually want to do is go get that workspace ID. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to open a new tab, app.8base.com. Once here, I'm going to log in, be back in 1 second. Okay, cool. So I was able to log into 8base, and essentially I just have a basic workspace for this demonstration here. You can use any workspace that you have, even a current project, and just add the table if you wanted to do it that way. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down into my settings, and I'm going to get my workspace ID. That's going to be important here. So first off, let's go back to VS Code. And what we're actually going to start by doing is by configuring the project. So what that means is we're going to run 8base configure and pretty much tell 8base what workspace this repo is going to be dealing with. And so first off, let's go down to group chat. That was the name of my workspace. We're done there. And next, we're going to use that import command that we saw in the tutorial. So let's go to 8base import -f. We're going to give it the file path, which is chat schema. It's right there. Then we're going to say that the workspace ID is the one we just copied. Run that. Cool. So this should be going. All right, it's importing the schema. Yep, this is essentially just going up and scaffolding the data model that we need for the chat room. And the second thing that we're going to do here too is we're going to just, in this .env.local file, we are going to add our workspace ID or set that variable. Cool. Paste that in there. Awesome. Now, if you just want to look at these environment variables really quickly, we can see that we have two API endpoints, one for just our GraphQL requests and the other for our WebSocket requests. So to the API endpoint, we're going to be making our queries and mutations. To the WS endpoint, we're going to be making our subscriptions or WebSocket connect. And then the workspace ID we're going to use in both those different API modules that we're going to create to specify essentially which workspace at those endpoints we are going to be dealing with. So let's jump back over to our tutorial. Okay, so we imported the schema. Now we want to go set the API permissions. So essentially, we're going to make this a public chat room. So we're not going to handle authentication. And what we're going to want to do is essentially tell the workspace what permissions we want a guest to have. The guest role is a special role in 8base. It means public permissions. So you don't have to pass any auth headers. You don't have to identify who you are. Anyone that wants to hit the API can then perform these actions. So let's go back to our workspace. Let's go to our app services, roles, click on guest. And here, we look back here, we can see that, okay, what we're going to want to do is make sure that the users, we can do all the users operations and then the messages operation. Cool. So if I go back in here, I'm going to say users. I'm going to say all records, and cool. And then we can see that we have the messages table here. Let's go back and look at, reload this page, because it should have imported our, cool. So we have our messages. Yep, this table was imported with the import command that we ran. So now if we go back to our roles on guest, we can see, cool, now we can do it with messages. So we want to be able to create messages, and we want to be able to see all messages. I think that's going to settle it. If not, we can come back later and update it as needed. Right now, then, we are now moving on to actually writing our queries. So these are going to be all the queries we need to run a chat room. We're just going to read through them really quickly and then copy them into our project, because that's where they're going to need to work. So for the first one, we're going to see that, okay, well, we have a few different GraphQL queries that we're writing here. So the first one is an initial chart data. Essentially, when we load this chat room, we're going to say, give us all the users and then give us the last 10 messages so we can populate it with some activity. Then we want to be able to create a user, which makes sense because whenever a user is created, we want to be able to create a user whenever they join the chat room. We want to delete a user whenever they leave the chat room. Once again, it's like a public chat room, so we just want to get rid of people after they leave. Then we want a user subscription. So if you look at the subscription, you can see that we say, hey, we want a subscription on the users table whenever there's a mutation that's create or delete. And when that happens, we want the mutation name back as well as the node, which would be the user in this case, with their ID and email. So this is going to allow us to do those real-time or listen to those real-time events. And pretty much the same thing runs for messages. We want to be able to create messages, connect them to the author, that's the person, that's the chat room participant, as well as listen to messages being created on the create event and get back some of the data from that message that was created. So let's copy this over to our project. We can see that it's telling us to put it in the utils GraphQL.js file. Cool. So we go source, utils, GraphQL.js. We're going to pop that right in there and keep cruising. So next up, we're actually going to be creating our API clients. That's both the Apollo client and then the subscription client for our WebSocket or our subscriptions. So we can see, I'm actually just going to copy this over to our code editor so we can enjoy the syntax highlighting. We can see that this one's supposed to go in source utils API.js. So api.js right here, awesome. Drop that in. Essentially, we can see that we're importing Apollo client from Apollo Boost, HTTP, create HTTP link, in-memory cache. We're getting our environment variables from our environment file. And then we are initializing the Apollo client with pretty much the basic options that you can give it. And what we're going to do is we're concatenating as well, or interpolating the endpoint with the workspace ID. So it's going to be api.abase.com/your workspace ID. That is the endpoint you'll have to use to run the basic GraphQL queries against the API, queries and mutations. So with that done, we initialize it, we export it, and we can use it in our Vue component. Now, if we go back, we can see that the next one is the subscription client. Once again, I'm going to copy this over, and then we can talk about it. Because once again, this one is a little bit more involved than the last one. So let me copy that. Cool. And this one's supposed to go in, where is it supposed to go? In utils.wss. Cool, right there. All right, copy this over. And so essentially what we're doing is we're going to be importing the implementation of WebSocket that we want to use in our subscription client, as well as the subscription client itself, which we're going to use from subscriptions, transport WS. Pretty sure it's an Apollo managed package. And then we're going to be importing, once again, the endpoint and the workspace ID. Now, when we go ahead and we initialize our subscription client, we're going to be giving it the endpoint. We're going to specify the reconnect true parameter. So if it disconnects for some reason, it will automatically reconnect. And then pass in the connection param workspace ID and set that to our workspace ID. Now, this is different than we did it with the API client, in which we, as part of the URL path, here we're actually putting it as a connection param, which kind of comes out as like a header, think of it that way. And then lastly, we're going to be specifying in the subscription client what implementation of WebSocket we want to use, which is the isomorphic WS that we imported. So adding that right there. So once that class is initialized, all we're going to do is we're going to export an object with two methods on it, subscribe and close. This subscribe method is the one that we're going to be passing our query, our subscription queries to, with the options that we want to use. Those options being, hey, what's the data callback that we use when the subscription client receives an event, or the error when there's an error callback, and of course any variables that we're actually passing to our subscription. And so we create that, we get the result back, and then whenever there is these events, which is next or error on the subscription client, we are passing the result to those callbacks that we defined ourselves. So pretty straightforward. And then the close method, the subscription client has a close method on it. We're essentially aliasing it so we can use it easily. And once that whole thing's configured, we just export it. And once again, we can use it now in our component. Pretty straightforward. So now what we're going to do is actually go in and write out our Vue component. And what's pretty cool is this whole chat room is just going to be one Vue component, and it's going to be pretty straightforward. So you could use this in any project you want. You could even use it in a non-Vue project if you just wanted to add Vue as part of the project, because Vue is that lightweight. But let's hop back, and first off, we're going to need our imports. So pretty straightforward. Bring these over. I'm going to add them to the top of our script file. And what we can see here is we're importing the API and the WSS modules that we just looked at initializing. We're importing all the different GraphQL queries, subscriptions, and mutations that we had written in the GraphQL.js file. And then we're importing some styles. Now, I promise you, these styles are not pretty to look at. You can develop any type of client application or any look and feel that you want, and I encourage you to go do that. I wanted this to be as bare bones as possible so that you can essentially look at the concepts, but we'd not get distracted with any type of CSS writing or whatnot. So drop those in there. Now, if we go down, we can now see that the next thing we want to add is our component data. So I'm going to bring this over and we'll talk through each one that we are adding in. So first off is in this data function, we're returning an object which is going to have messages array on it. So that's where we're going to store all our message objects. We're going to have a new message, which is where we're going to essentially put the string that's the draft when someone's typing a message before they've sent it. Then we have this object called me, which by default has an empty email. That's going to represent the user that is participating in the chat room. And then users, which is going to be everyone in the chat room. We're going to keep track of that and manage that, that array. So let's just save that. and then we're going to go back. And now what we're going to be adding is our lifecycle hooks. So depending on what framework you use, and just to reiterate that, you can do this with any framework that you'd want to use. The components might have different life cycles, or you might trigger it at different ways. Essentially with Vue, we're using the lifecycle hooks, create and before destroy, which run when a component is first created and then right before it's destroyed. And essentially what we're going to want to do in these lifecycle hooks is initialize the chat room with the data we need, initialize the subscriptions that we want to listen to for when users are created or deleted or messages are created. And so we can just see that right here pretty clearly. So when it's created, this created function is going to run. We're going to use that WSS model and subscribe to the user subscription, which we wrote back here. Let's find that to look at. Cool, yeah, so a subscription on the users table. Let's only get something when there was a mutation on create or delete, and let's get the mutation back and the node with the information. So pretty straightforward. We're just going to pass it that subscription, and then the data callback is going to be the handle user function, which we've yet to write, but we're going to look at that in just a second. Same thing with messages. WSS, subscribe to the messages subscription, give it the callback data, add message. Then we're going to run an API query and get the initial chart data. And from the response that we get, we're going to get the data back and then assign the users list items to the users in our component data, and then the messages list items to our messages on our component data. And then one thing I added here too was that before, if you were to reload the page, this callback would be triggered. That's just going to run this close chat method, which we're going to look at in a second, to essentially delete the user that was in the chat and cancel their subscriptions. And then that same thing is going to run on before destroy. Cool. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go past that, and now the component methods. So there's a few more of these, but we're going to breeze through them really quickly because they're pretty self-explanatory, and you'll be able to jump in and play with them yourself if you'd like to. So I'm just going to copy over the user or the methods object here with all the methods on it. So let's just drop that in there. Cool. I'm going to put that there. I don't know where that comma came from. And awesome. Let's just run through this now. Okay, so now we have the methods, and these are the methods that are available on our component. We have a create users method. What does it do? It hits the API, runs a mutation with the create user mutation, and gives it the email address as a variable. Pretty straightforward. We have a delete user method. It hits the API with a mutation, delete user, passes it the ID. Nice. We have a handle user callback. So once again, in the created lifecycle hook, we're using this handle user for the user subscription. Now, when that subscription returns data or that event is triggered, it's going to tell us the mutation that ran, create or delete. So we have this, this little switch statement right here, essentially, that's, well, get the correct callback back from this object, and then invoke it, passing the node as data, which is add user and remove user, which is right here. So if it's add user, we get the user. If the email address is the current participant email address, we set that user to the me record on the me data property on the component. And then we also just will always push it into the user's array. Remove user, we filter the user by its ID out. And that can be any user, whether it's the current participant or any other participant. Because remember, one cool thing to notice here is that even in like the delete user mutation that we run or create user mutation that we run, we're actually not listening for any response because we're getting those responses through our subscriptions. So we're just sending these off and expecting them to come through subscriptions, which is just a really nice, clean way of handling it. Then we have our create message method. Pretty straightforward. Create message, give it the ID and the content, and then after this is run, we're actually listening to the response here. We're just going to clear the new message because essentially that message was created. We empty the input. Add message, get the message back from the subscription, put it into the messages array, and then close chat, which is we're going to run the close method on our subscription client. Now that will actually close our subscriptions for both our user subscription as well as our messages subscription, because it's the same client, just two different queries. As well as we're going to run the delete user method, which we just looked at, and set me back to the empty default. Pretty straightforward. So going back here, now let's scroll down and look at the component template. Now, you can build, once again, a template however you want to. You can do it with any framework you want to. This is essentially like what is the basic template that you need to make this messaging app functional. However, we will just go over it really quickly. So first off, if me, that's the current user, has an ID, that means they are a created user, then we'll show the chat. If not, we're going to go down to the if-else statement. We have a chat sign up, simple form. Sign up, and there's an input where it uses the email address. So it's bound to the email address. So as you type in, it's going to save that as your email address. And when you blur the input, it's going to go ahead and create the user using that email address that you input. That's it. And so once that subscription returns that user, if it was you, the email addresses are matching. It sets you in your ID. Then there's an ID, drops into the chat component. You can tell us how many users are online. We then have a close chat button that we can use. Want to close out the chat. For every message that we have, we're going to render it out. And we're going to add this me class, essentially, to where if the user ID or the participant ID is your ID, then I think this is actually the author. I'm going to update that and hope for the best. So if actually, you know what we can just do? We can look back at our GraphQL subscriptions, and we can see that when we get a message, author ID email. Cool, I had that right. So if the message author ID is equal to your ID, then we're going to be using me class, and that's how we'll delineate, hey, should these messages or yours go on which side of the screen, so you can see where your messages are. And then very simply, there's an input for a new message. So once you write it, you click create message, and it's going to send that. So pretty sure that's it. Let's boot this thing up and see what happens. So yarn serve, run that. So this will probably just take a second to boot up. And essentially what we're going to do is first we're just going to see if it works, and then we're going to open two windows and watch kind of the chat work back and forth with each other. So let's go here, reload this. Okay, what's my email address? It's john@joe.co. Right? Exit out the input. And cool. So it says there's 2 users are online. We go into our 8-base workspace and we go to our users table. We can see here that john@joe.co signed up, and then my default account is there. So I'm going to write my first message. It's going to be hello. Send that hello. I'm on the right side of the screen there. Now there's no one else to talk to, so I'm going to open another browser tab, localhost 8080. Here I'm going to say I'm steve@me.co. And Steve is now in the chat room. So 3 users online, and if I go back to this window, 3 users online. All right, all this is working. So, and this one's on the right side of the screen. So, hello, what's up, John? Cool. And I go back here, got the message, right? So here's our subscriptions. The chat room is all alive, right? And so we can just say something random like hello again and send that. Awesome. And so here we go. And then once again, what's even cooler, we can just keep adding this. So if this was a chat room, everyone could just keep piling on. Let's say jess@yes.co. And Jess is now in the chat room. Hey guys. I'm sure you guys are thrilled at this point of me talking to myself by 3 different personalities. But as you can see, this is all working pretty seamlessly. So I hope this video gave you a good idea of how easy it is to get started using subscriptions and building real-time event-driven components or applications. This is just the surface, right? There's so many other things you can do. We could do different channels. We could do authenticated private messages, images, all these different things, and build a really, really rich messaging application. And if this video is well received, if you guys like it, ask for it in the comments, vote it up. Absolutely, will that be the next thing that we dive into? And once again, if you found this video helpful, please like it as well as subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching and looking forward to seeing you in future videos.